Hi! In the previous video we looked at handling errors in a function. In this video we'll take a look at applying debug function to user-defined function, debug using browser function, and using trace and traceback function. As a programmer, debugging is the most common task faced on a daily basis. The simplest debugging method is to insert a print statement at every desired location. However, this method is rather inefficient. Here, we'll illustrate how to use some R debugging tools to help accelerate the debugging process. First, let's see how to debug a function by applying debug to an existing function. We create a debug function with x and y as argument, but we only return x. We then pass only 2 to debug func. Argument y is missing with no default, since we've passed only a single value. Next, apply the debug function onto debug func. Here we apply the debug function on the name, argument, or function. We pass 2 to debug func again. That's our output. Whenever we invoke debug func, our R console will enter a browser mode with browse as the prompt at the start of each line. We can type help to list all possible commands. Then we can type in to move on to the next debugging step. Let's use Ctrl L to clear the screen. Next we type objects and ls to list all current objects. At each step we can type the variable name to obtain the current value. Again, y is missing with no default, since value of y was not passed. At the last step we can type q to quit debugging mode. We can then leave the debug mode using the undebug function. Besides using the debug function, we can insert the browser function within the code to debug it. Let's debug the function using the browser function. After we have inserted browser parentheses into debug func 2, whenever we invoke the function, the R function will step right into the next line below the browser function. Now, if you want to move among frames or return to the top level of debugging mode, we can use the recover function. To recover the debug process, type recover during the browsing process. On the other hand, we can use the trace function to insert code into the debug function at step 4. Here we assign what to trace as debug func 2 and set the tracer to examine whether y is missing. If y is missing, it'll execute the browser parentheses function. We can then track the debugging process from step 4 and determine the inserted code. At that argument, we set 4 to the argument so that the tracer code will be inserted at line 4 of debug func 2. Then, when we call the debug func 2 function, the function enters right into where the tracer is located and executes the browser function as the y argument is missing. So, we can track the usage of certain functions with a trace function. Let's trace sum. Now let's pass the debug function 3 using arguments 2, 3. Here we've traced sum. We can also print the calling stack of a function with a traceback function. We pass 2 unassigned parameters, x and y, into an LM linear model fitting function. As we do not assign any value to these 2 parameters, the function returns an error message in the console output. To understand the calling stack sequence, we can use the traceback function to print out the stack. Let's pass the traceback function. It'll help us trace whatever we want to. Pretty cool, isn't it? In this video, we learned about the debugging function. That marks the end of the section. In this section, we looked at creating R functions, matching arguments, and understanding environments. Then we moved to lexical scoping, closure, lazy evaluation, infix operators, and finally replacement and error handling functions. Awesome! In the next section, we'll take a look at data extracting, transforming, and loading.